Big thanks for coming back and hanging out with me again.
5 years of marriage felt like a lifetime and a moment all at once. I still remember the first time I met Kelly. She had this energy about her, like she could command the chaos of the universe and still find time to smile. It was that smile that got me. The kind that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Back then, we were unstoppable, two people too stubborn to let the world slow us down. Our relationship was built on passion and ambition. I'm an investigator. The job demands long hours, endless attention to detail, and a kind of stubborn persistence that doesn't sit well with most people. Kelly? She's a surgeon, someone who thrives in chaos, whose hands move with the kind of precision most people only dream of. Together, we were a force, though sometimes I wondered if we were two trains running parallel on tracks that might never meet. Life with Kelly wasn't always easy. Our work schedules often clashed, and when they didn't, we were usually too tired to do much more than share a quick meal before collapsing into bed. Still, there were moments, quiet mornings over coffee, her head resting on my shoulder during rare evenings off, that reminded me why I fell in love with her. She called me her sunshine. It was corny, sure, but I liked it. I liked the way her voice softened when she said it, like I was the one good thing she could count on in a world that demanded so much of her. 5 years of marriage taught me to take those moments where I could find them. Most days, Kelly left the house before dawn, her scrubs neatly pressed, her hair pulled back in that effortless way she always managed. I'd kiss her goodbye, still half asleep, and roll over, savoring the warmth she left behind in the bed. By the time I started my day, she was already halfway through hers, elbows deep in someone's chest cavity, or stitching up a wound only she had the skill to fix. My days weren't much less demanding. Investigative work wasn't glamorous. It was long hours chasing leads, poring over paperwork, and staring down people who thought they could outsmart the law. It was rewarding in its own way, but it didn't leave much room for anything else. Still, we made it work. I'd share the highlights of my cases over dinner, and Kelly would counter with stories from the hospital. Some nights, we'd laugh until our sides hurt. Other nights, we'd fall into bed too tired to do more than mumble goodnight. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. Kelly was everything I wasn't: vibrant, spontaneous, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they mattered. She had this way of throwing herself into everything she did, whether it was a complicated surgery or a last-minute dinner party she insisted we host despite having no time to prepare. And me? I was the steady one, the rock she could lean on when the world got too loud. I liked being her rock. I liked knowing that no matter how chaotic our lives got, we'd always have each other. Sure, there were challenges. Marriage wasn't easy, especially when you're both married to your jobs. But we made it 5 years, and that had to count for something, right? That morning started like any other. Kelly was out the door before the sun was up, her bag slung over one shoulder, a coffee in hand. She kissed me goodbye, her lips warm and familiar, and I watched her go, already planning to surprise her with takeout from her favorite Thai place later that night. It was a small gesture, but I knew she'd appreciate it. I had no way of knowing then that the day would bring changes I couldn't anticipate. At that moment, life felt normal, comfortable, safe, and I was content to let it stay that way. Looking back, I realize how blind I was to the cracks forming beneath the surface. But hindsight's funny like that, isn't it? You never see the earthquake coming until the ground's already shaking. Kelly called me that afternoon, her voice edged with frustration. "The car died on the way home from work," she said. "I barely managed to pull into a repair shop." "Where are you now?" I asked, already reaching for my keys. "Relax, sunshine," she replied, the nickname softening my concern. "I'm fine. I'm at a small shop nearby. They're looking at it now. I'll call you when I'm done." That was Kelly, always self-sufficient, always calm under pressure. I figured it was just another minor inconvenience in a day filled with them and pushed the thought aside. What I didn't know was that this wasn't just any repair shop, and the man who stepped out to help her wasn't just any mechanic. The repair shop was modest, tucked away on the edge of town, its sign barely legible from years of wear. Dick's Auto Service. Kelly told me later that she almost didn't stop there, but the car gave her no choice. Dick came out of the garage as she pulled in, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. He had a confident stride and a smile that Kelly would later describe as disarming. He looked like he belonged in a magazine ad for rugged charm, broad shoulders, sun-bleached hair, and a laid-back demeanor that instantly put her at ease. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, his voice warm and casual. "Honestly, I have no idea," Kelly replied, stepping out of the car. "It just stopped running." Dick popped the hood and leaned in, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Kelly stood by, watching as he worked, the hum of passing cars filling the silence. After a few minutes, he straightened up and smiled. "Found the issue. Looks like the alternator gave out. I can have it fixed in an hour." Kelly sighed in relief. "Thank you. I've had a long day, and I really didn't need this on top of it." Dick smiled again, that easy charm radiating off him. "We've all been there. Why don't you take a seat inside? I'll get this sorted out." Kelly hesitated but eventually took his advice. She sat in the small waiting area, scrolling through her phone to pass the time. When Dick came back to let her know the car was ready, he handed her the keys with a slight flourish, as if it were a grand gesture. "All set," he said. "Shouldn't give you any more trouble." Kelly smiled, genuinely grateful. "Thank you. Really. You've been a lifesaver." "It's what I'm here for," Dick replied, his eyes lingering on hers for a beat too long. Then, almost casually, he added, "If you ever need anything, feel free to call. Here's my card." She hesitated but took the card, slipping it into her purse. She told herself it was just politeness, just a professional gesture. But as she drove home, she couldn't shake the memory of his smile or the way he had made her day just a little brighter. Later that evening, Kelly recounted the story over dinner, her tone light and conversational. "He was very nice," she said. "And quick. I was out of there in no time." I chuckled, happy to see her in a good mood after a rough day. "Sounds like you found a gem of a mechanic." "Yeah," she said, almost absent-mindedly. "He really was." I didn't think much of it at the time. To me, it was just another anecdote in the ongoing chaos of our lives. But for Kelly, it was the beginning of something neither of us could have predicted. It started with a text 2 days later. "Hi, Kelly. Just checking in to make sure the car's running smoothly." She stared at her phone for a moment before typing back. "Yes, all good. Thanks again." The conversation could have ended there, but it didn't. Dick responded with a joke about how cars are like relationships. They need constant care to keep running. Kelly laughed, and before she knew it, they were exchanging messages that felt more personal than professional. It was innocent, at first. Or at least that's what Kelly told herself. A few friendly texts, a compliment here and there. But there was something about Dick's attention that was different. He made her feel noticed in a way that she hadn't felt in years. With Jim, life had become routine, a series of shared schedules and polite exchanges between two overworked people. With Dick, it felt new, exciting, unpredictable. When he suggested grabbing coffee one afternoon, Kelly hesitated but eventually agreed. It was just coffee, after all. Nothing more. The cafe was small and tucked away, the kind of place where no one paid attention to strangers sitting together. Dick arrived early, greeting her with that same easy smile she remembered from the repair shop. They talked about everything and nothing, her work, his, the little frustrations of daily life. He was charming, funny, attentive. And when their hands brushed as they reached for their mugs, Kelly felt a spark she hadn't expected. She told herself it was harmless, just a moment of connection with someone who seemed to genuinely enjoy her company. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. As she drove home, she couldn't stop replaying their conversation in her mind, his laughter echoing like a song she couldn't forget. At home, I kissed her as she walked through the door, oblivious to the shift in her demeanor. She called me Sunshine, as she always did, her voice warm and affectionate. And I believed her, because I wanted to believe her. But that night, as Kelly lay beside me in bed, her phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. She glanced at the screen, a small smile tugging at her lips. I didn't notice. I was already drifting off to sleep, unaware that the ground beneath us had begun to shift. It began subtly, like the softest breeze whispering through the cracks of an old house. Kelly was always busy. Her demanding schedule at the hospital left little room for anything else. So, when she started staying a bit later or leaving a little earlier, I didn't question it. That was just life with Kelly, and I respected her dedication. But I didn't know what was happening outside of my sight. Kelly and Dick's affair didn't start with grand declarations or dramatic moments. It began with 1,000 small choices. A lingering text, an extra coffee date, a joke shared that turned into a flirtation. What surprised Kelly most wasn't that she felt drawn to him, but how effortlessly it all happened. It wasn't planned, it was as though gravity itself pulled her into his orbit. She found herself looking forward to his messages, her heart skipping when her phone lit up with his name. The banter, the compliments, the feeling of being seen, it was addictive. She told herself it was harmless, that it didn't mean anything. But she knew deep down that wasn't true. Their first kiss happened on a rainy afternoon. Kelly had taken her car in for a follow-up repair, an excuse she barely managed to justify to herself. She stood under the awning of the repair shop as the rain came down in steady sheets, her umbrella forgotten in the passenger seat. Dick joined her, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Looks like you're stuck here for a while," he said with a grin, handing her the cup. Kelly smiled back, taking the coffee and feeling the warmth spread through her hands. "Good thing you're here to keep me company." Their conversation drifted from light-hearted jokes to something deeper, dreams, regrets, moments of vulnerability that neither of them had shared with anyone else in a long time. The rain muffled the rest of the world, wrapping them in a cocoon of intimacy. "I shouldn't be here," Kelly said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the rain. Dick turned to her, his gaze steady. "But you are." For a moment, either of them moved. Then, without thinking, without planning, Kelly leaned in. Their lips met, hesitant at first, then hungrier, as if both of them had been starving and only now realized it. When she finally pulled away, Kelly's breath was shaky, her mind racing. "I can't do this," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Dick nodded, but the faint smile on his lips told her he didn't believe her. "You can walk away any time," he said. "But you don't want to." At home, I didn't notice the change in Kelly right away. She was still her usual self, kind, warm, attentive. She called me Sunshine, and kissed me on the cheek as I recounted stories from my latest case. But there were moments, fleeting and rare, when I caught her staring off into space, her expression unreadable. I chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, she worked harder than anyone I knew. If only I had known what was really going on. The affair quickly became a whirlwind. Kelly found herself sneaking away during lunch breaks, making excuses to leave the house early or stay late at the hospital. She hated the lies, the deception, but the pull toward Dick was too strong. He made her feel alive, in a way she hadn't felt in years. With Dick, there were no responsibilities, no schedules to keep, no expectations to meet. Their moments together were stolen and fleeting, but that only made them more intoxicating. Kelly described it as stepping into a different world, one where she wasn't a surgeon, a wife, or anyone other than the woman she used to be, the woman she sometimes missed. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a documentary about unsolved crimes, Kelly's phone buzzed. She glanced at it quickly, her expression unreadable. "Work?" I asked, my attention still on the screen. "Yeah," she replied, her voice casual. "They just need me to check on something for tomorrow." I didn't think twice about it. Kelly's job was demanding, and her phone was always buzzing with some update or another. I trusted her completely. Why wouldn't I? As she typed her reply, I reached over and squeezed her hand. "You work too hard," I said with a smile. She looked up at me, her eyes soft. So do you. For a moment, everything felt normal, like nothing had changed. But when she leaned over to kiss me goodnight, there was a fleeting hesitation, so subtle I might have imagined it. I brushed it off, convinced that we were still the couple we had always been. Kelly tried to rationalize her actions. She told herself that what she had with Dick didn't take away from what she had with me. It was separate, compartmentalized. With Dick, she could escape. With me, she had stability, love, and a home. In her mind, she was keeping the two worlds from colliding, believing that as long as I didn't know, no one would get hurt. But secrets have a way of growing, of taking root and spreading like weeds. Kelly didn't see it yet, but the cracks were already forming. And while I may have been blind to them then, it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. It was late on a Friday afternoon when Kelly got the call. She had just finished her rounds at the hospital, and was reviewing her notes, when her phone buzzed on the desk beside her. The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. "We've got an emergency coming in, a workplace injury. Prep for surgery." Kelly moved instinctively, her exhaustion melting away as adrenaline took over. This was her world, the controlled chaos of life and death. She scrubbed in, her mind already analyzing the possibilities. It wasn't until she entered the operating room and saw the patient on the table that her heart stopped. It was Dick. Her breath caught in her throat, but her training kicked in. She couldn't think about how or why he was here, not now. Dick's face was pale, his chest rising and falling shallowly as the nurses worked to stabilize him. Kelly focused on the injury, a deep laceration across his abdomen, dangerously close to vital organs. The nurse beside her handed over the scalpel, and Kelly steadied her trembling hands. "Let's save him," she said, her voice firm despite the storm raging inside her. The surgery was grueling. Blood pooled faster than they could suction it away, and the wound revealed layers of damage Kelly hadn't anticipated. She blocked out everything but the task at hand, moving with the precision of a sculptor chipping away at marble. Hours passed like minutes, and when she finally stitched the last suture, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. "He's stable," she announced, stepping back from the table. Relief flooded her, but it was quickly followed by a wave of panic. What if someone had seen her reaction? What if anyone suspected how much this man meant to her? She stripped off her gloves and left the room, her legs unsteady as she made her way to the break room. She sank into a chair, her head in her hands, trying to process what had just happened. She couldn't ignore the irony. She had saved the man who had become her escape, her secret, her biggest mistake. That evening, I noticed Kelly seemed more distant than usual. She was quieter at dinner, her responses short and distracted. I chalked it up to another long day at the hospital. She had been pulling double shifts for weeks, and exhaustion wasn't new for either of us. Over dessert, I brought up one of my recent cases, a car theft that had spiraled into something bigger. "You won't believe this one," I said, leaning back in my chair. "We've been chasing a lead on a stolen luxury car, and it turns out the guy we're looking for works at a repair shop out on the edge of town. Real shady place, tucked away off the main road." Kelly froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What repair shop?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Dick's Auto Service," I said, shaking my head. The owner's name came up in a statement from one of the guys we arrested. Supposedly, this Dick character was running more than just a garage. Her reaction was subtle, but I noticed it. A slight stiffening of her shoulders, a faint flush on her cheeks. "Do you think he's guilty?" she asked. "Hard to say," I replied. "We've got evidence tying him to the stolen car, but nothing concrete yet. We're still investigating." Kelly set her fork down and folded her hands in her lap. "What's his name?" "Dick Howard," I said, frowning. "Why? Do you know him?" For a long moment, Kelly didn't respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a strain beneath it. "I had my car repaired there a few weeks ago. He seemed decent. I just can't imagine him being involved in something like that." I studied her, trying to decipher her tone. "A lot of people seem decent until you dig deeper," I said. That's the job. Kelly didn't reply, and the silence between us grew thick, heavy. She excused herself to bed early, leaving me alone at the table with my thoughts. I told myself it was nothing, just Kelly being Kelly, always empathizing with people, always wanting to see the good in them. But something about her reaction stuck with me, an itch I couldn't quite scratch. In the days that followed, Kelly's behavior became more erratic. She seemed distracted, jumping at the sound of her phone and avoiding eye contact during our conversations. I asked her if everything was okay, and she brushed it off with a tired smile. Just work, she said. It's been a rough week. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But the cracks were starting to show, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Meanwhile, the investigation into Dick Howard took a darker turn. We discovered the stolen car in the back of his shop, hidden beneath a tarp. It was the evidence we needed to make an arrest, and I was there when it happened. Dick didn't resist. He came quietly, his face pale but calm. He looked at me as they led him away, and for a brief moment, I saw something in his eyes I couldn't place. Was it guilt? Or something else entirely? Back at the station, I pored over the case files, determined to make sense of it all. But no matter how much I studied the evidence, something didn't add up. Dick's story was too clean, too rehearsed. And yet there were details that didn't fit the profile of a criminal. It gnawed at me, the way every good case does, until you find the missing piece. That night, Kelly confronted me in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. "You need to let him go," she said, her voice trembling. I turned to her, startled. "What are you talking about?" "Dick," she said, her eyes pleading. "He didn't do it. You're wrong about him." I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "Kelly, what do you know about him?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence broke into the room like a tidal wave, and in that moment, I understood. Everything. The silence was suffocating. Kelly stood across from me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale but resolute. My stomach churned as I repeated the question, my voice steady but laced with unease. "Kelly, what do you know about Dick?" Her lips parted, but for a moment, no words came. Then she sighed, the kind of sigh that spoke of defeat. "I know he didn't steal that car," she said finally. "You're wrong about him." I frowned, the tension in my chest tightening. "How can you be so sure?" Kelly hesitated, glancing at the floor before meeting my eyes. "Because I know him." Her voice trembled slightly, but her words were steady enough to make my blood run cold. My pulse quickened as I straightened up from where I'd been leaning against the counter. "How well do you know him, Kelly?" I asked, though the answer already loomed in the air between us. She swallowed hard, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "We've been seeing each other," she admitted, her voice barely audible. The room spun, the words hitting me like a physical blow. "Seeing each other?" I repeated, my voice low and measured, like I was cross-examining a suspect. "How long?" Kelly's eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't look away. "For weeks." I stared at her, the weight of her confession settling in my chest like a stone. Weeks. My wife, the woman I'd built my life with, had been sneaking around with another man for weeks. The timeline flashed through my mind, matching up with moments I'd dismissed as nothing, the extra shifts, the late nights, the distant looks. "And you didn't think to tell me?" I asked, my voice rising. "You thought what, you just keep living this double life?" "I didn't plan for it to happen," Kelly said quickly, her tone desperate. "It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. It just—" She stopped herself, running a hand through her hair. "I wasn't looking for this, Jim. I swear. But it happened anyway." I snapped, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "You made a choice, Kelly. Over and over again, you made a choice to betray me." Her tears spilled over, but she didn't try to hide them. "I know," she said, her voice cracking. "I know I hurt you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But Dick isn't who you think he is. He's a good man, Jim. He didn't steal that car, and you have to believe me." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. I have to believe you? I asked incredulously. You've been lying to me for weeks, and now you expect me to just take your word for it. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Kelly said, her voice firm despite her tears. I'm asking you to look at the evidence. Dick didn't do this. I studied her, my anger mixing with something else, something I didn't want to name. Despite everything, there was still a part of me that wanted to trust her, to believe that the woman I'd married was still in there somewhere. But the betrayal cut too deep. I can't do this right now, I said, stepping away from her. I need time. Kelly nodded silently, her expression crumbling as I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't look back. The next morning, I buried myself in work, hoping it would drown out the noise in my head. The case against Dick was airtight, or so it seemed. The stolen car had been found in his garage, tucked beneath a tarp. Witnesses placed him near the scene of the theft. And yet something didn't sit right with me. I spent hours reviewing the evidence, trying to ignore the weight of Kelly's words. Dick isn't who you think he is. Her voice echoed in my mind, stubborn and insistent. I hated that part of me believed her, even now. That evening, I decided to confront Dick directly. He was sitting in the interrogation room when I walked in, his hands cuffed to the table. He looked up as I entered, his expression calm but weary. You've got some explaining to do, I said, dropping the file onto the table in front of him. Dick leaned back in his chair, raising an eyebrow. I already told your guys everything I know. Yeah? I shot back. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're neck-deep in this car theft ring. Dick sighed, shaking his head. I didn't steal that car, he said evenly. I've been over this. Then why was it in your garage? I pressed, narrowing my eyes. Dick hesitated, glancing at the file before meeting my gaze. A guy brought it in for a repair, he said finally. I didn't know it was stolen until I ran the plates. By then, it was too late. Too late for what? I asked, my voice hard. Too late to back out, Dick admitted. The guy who brought it in made it clear I didn't have a choice. He told me to keep my mouth shut and do the job. When I refused, things escalated. I studied him carefully, looking for any sign of deception. But his story felt too polished, too rehearsed. Still, there was something in his eyes, something that made me pause. And Kelly? I asked, my voice quieter now. What does she mean to you? Dick's expression softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something real, guilt, regret, maybe even love. She means everything, he said quietly. But I never wanted to hurt her. Or you. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to lash out. I wanted to hate him, to throw him back into the cell and forget about him. But the truth was more complicated than I wanted to admit. And as much as I hated it, I couldn't ignore the possibility that he was telling the truth. When I got home that night, Kelly was waiting for me. She looked up from the couch as I walked in, her expression wary. What did he say? She asked softly. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood in the doorway, staring at the woman I'd once trusted with everything. He said he cares about you, I said finally. That he never wanted to hurt you. Kelly nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I never wanted to hurt you either, Jim. The words were small comfort. I walked past her without another word, the weight of the day, and of everything I'd learned, dragging me down. The next morning, I arrived at the station earlier than usual. The weight of everything, Kelly's betrayal, Dick's story, and the gaps in the evidence, had kept me awake all night. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I started by reviewing the files on Dick again. The car theft operation we'd uncovered was extensive, high-end vehicles stolen, stripped, and sold off the books. It was slick, professional, and cold. Dick didn't fit the mold. Yes, the stolen car was found in his garage, but that felt too easy, too convenient. Criminals at this level didn't make rookie mistakes. Still, that didn't mean he was innocent. I brought in one of my best detectives, Marcus, to go over the evidence with me. Marcus was sharp, methodical, and didn't miss a thing. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked, leaning over the table where we'd spread out the photos and statements. "I think something's off," I said, pointing to a timeline on the board. "Dick claims the car was dropped off for repairs, and when he realized it was stolen, he refused to work on it. But that doesn't explain why it was hidden in his garage." Marcus scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Unless someone planted it there to frame him." That idea had crossed my mind, but I couldn't say it out loud without sounding like I was defending him. "Let's dig deeper into who brought the car in," I said instead. "If he's lying, we'll catch him. If he's not, then someone else is pulling the strings," Marcus finished. By lunchtime, we tracked down the man who had brought the stolen car to Dick's shop. His name was Terry Jansen, a low-level thug with a record for petty theft. He wasn't the mastermind behind the operation, that much was clear, but he was connected to someone who was. I leaned back in my chair, staring at Terry's file. "This guy doesn't have the brains to run something like this," I muttered. "Then who does?" Marcus asked. "That's what we're going to find out." Meanwhile, Kelly had taken matters into her own hands. I didn't know it at the time, but while I was chasing leads at the station, she was at the hospital piecing things together. She knew Dick wasn't capable of the crimes he was accused of, and she was determined to prove it, even if it meant stepping into dangerous territory. During her breaks, Kelly revisited conversations she'd had with Dick. He'd mentioned names before, casually and without much context, but one stood out: Marty Blake. She searched the name online. It didn't take long to find him, a known associate of several high-profile criminals, with a history of theft, fraud, and extortion. He had connections to stolen cars and organized crime, but no convictions to show for it. Kelly knew she'd found a lead. Back at the station, Marcus and I hit a wall. Terry wasn't talking, and the evidence we had was circumstantial at best. Frustrated, I stepped outside for some air, my mind racing. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Kelly. "We need to talk." I stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "About what?" Her reply came quickly. "I found something." We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, neutral ground where either of us could retreat into the familiarity of home. Kelly looked exhausted when she walked in, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her eyes shadowed with guilt and determination. "I know you don't trust me right now," she said, sitting down across from me. "But I need you to listen." "I'm here," I said, though my tone was colder than I intended. Kelly slid her phone across the table. The screen displayed an address and a name: Marty Blake. "He's connected to Dick," she said. "He's the one you should be looking at." I frowned, picking up her phone to examine the details. "How do you know this?" "Dick mentioned him," she admitted, her voice small. "Not directly, but he talked about a guy who made trouble at the shop. I think it's Marty." I set the phone down, leaning back in my chair. "So you're investigating this now?" Kelly flinched but nodded. "I'm trying to fix this, Jim. I'm trying to help." "For him," I corrected, my voice sharp. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. Instead, she said quietly, "And for you. For us." Despite my anger, the lead was solid. Marcus and I investigated Marty Blake and discovered he had a history of organized crime. He wasn't just connected to the stolen car operation, he was running it. Surveillance footage confirmed Marty had been at Dick's shop the day the car was dropped off, and we uncovered financial records linking him to other stolen vehicles. We brought Marty in, and under pressure he folded. He admitted to framing Dick, knowing the mechanic would make an easy scapegoat if the operation was ever uncovered. With Marty's confession, Dick was exonerated. The charges against him were dropped, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But the damage was done. Kelly and I didn't celebrate the win together. I spent the evening alone in our quiet house, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at the photos on the mantel. One of them was from our wedding day, her smile radiant, my arm wrapped around her waist. We looked so happy, so sure of the life we were building together. Now, I wasn't so sure. Kelly came home late, her expression tentative as she stepped into the living room. "Dick's free," she said softly. "I know," I replied, not looking at her. "I'm the one who made it happen." She stood there for a moment, and I could feel the weight of her gaze. "Jim," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I've broken your trust. And I don't know if I can ever fix that. But I want to try." I finally looked at her, my chest tightening at the sight of the woman I'd once trusted with everything. "I don't know if we can fix this," I said honestly. "Not now. Maybe not ever." Her tears spilled over, and she nodded, her voice breaking. "I understand." The silence that followed was unbearable, and for the first time, I wondered if love could ever truly survive betrayal. The next day at work, I sat alone in my office, staring at the case board. Marty Blake was in custody, Dick was free, and the stolen car operation had been dismantled. By all accounts, the case was closed. But I didn't feel closure, far from it. If anything, I felt hollow. It wasn't just Kelly's betrayal gnawing at me. It was the nagging feeling that I'd let my personal life cloud my judgment. I'd gone after Dick like he was guilty from the start, not because of the evidence, but because of the way his name had become entangled with my wife's. I had failed. As an investigator, as a husband. And now, I was left to pick up the pieces. Meanwhile, Kelly was at the hospital, throwing herself into her work. She didn't say much when we crossed paths in the mornings, and I didn't ask. The silence between us was loud, deafening. Every glance she gave me seemed to carry the weight of unspoken words, but I wasn't ready to hear them. Not yet. Dick wasn't out of the picture, though. When I stopped by the station that afternoon, Marcus handed me a file. "Got a call from Blake's lawyer," he said, dropping it on my desk. "Apparently Blake's been talking. Says the operation went deeper than we thought." I frowned, flipping through the file. "How much deeper?" "Enough that Dick's name came up again," Marcus said. "Blake's claiming Dick wasn't just an innocent bystander. Says he knew more about the operation than he let on." I stiffened, my instincts kicking in. "Blake's lying," I said. "He's trying to drag someone else down with him." "Maybe," Marcus admitted. "But if there's even a chance he's telling the truth, we need to follow up." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. The thought of reopening the investigation made my stomach churn, but I couldn't ignore the possibility. If Dick had been involved all along, I needed to know. That evening, I found myself driving out to Dick's auto shop on the outskirts of town. It was late, the streets quiet, and the garage looked deserted as I pulled up. The overhead light above the door flickered, casting eerie shadows across the lot. Dick emerged from the shop as I stepped out of my car. He looked surprised to see me but didn't flinch. "Detective," he said, his tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" "I need to ask you a few more questions," I said, my voice firm. "Mind if we talk inside?" He hesitated, then nodded, motioning for me to follow. The garage was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of grease and oil. Tools hung neatly on the walls, and a half-repaired car sat on the lift in the center of the room. "What's this about?" Dick asked, crossing his arms. I leaned against the workbench, studying him. "Marty Blake's been talking," I said. "He claims you knew more about the stolen cars than you let on." Dick's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Of course he'd say that," he said. "He's trying to cover his own ass." "Is he?" I pressed. "Or is there something you're not telling me?" Dick exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I didn't steal that car. I've told you everything I know. Blake and his guys showed up at my shop, trying to pull me into their operation. When I refused, they framed me. That's the truth." I studied him carefully, watching for any signs of deception. But his eyes held steady, and his voice didn't waver. If he was lying, he was damn good at it. "And Kelly?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "Where does she fit into all of this?" Dick's expression softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of guilt. Kelly didn't know anything about the cars, he said. She's not involved in this, Jim. None of this is her fault. His words didn't bring the comfort I'd hoped for. If anything, they made me feel worse. I nodded slowly, pushing off the workbench. If you're lying, I'll find out, I said. And if you're telling the truth, then stay out of trouble. Dick didn't respond as I turned and walked out of the garage. The night air was cool, and I stood by my car for a moment, staring up at the stars. I'd come here looking for answers, but I wasn't sure I'd found any. When I got home, the house was dark. Kelly was sitting on the couch, her legs curled under her, a book resting in her lap. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes wary. "Long day?" she asked softly. I nodded, hanging my jacket by the door. "Yeah." She closed the book, setting it aside. "Did you see him?" "Yeah," I said again, my voice clipped. "He says he's innocent. That he's been telling the truth all along." Kelly's shoulders sagged with relief, but I didn't share her sense of victory. Instead, I crossed the room and sat down in the armchair across from her, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. "What happens now, Kelly?" I asked, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "What happens to us?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I want to try to fix this. I want to fix us." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Fix us?" I repeated. "You think it's that simple?" "No," she said quickly, her voice breaking. "I know it's not simple, Jim. I know I broke something in us that might never be whole again. But I can't just give up." I stared at her, the woman I'd loved for so many years, the woman who had betrayed me in ways I never thought possible. Part of me wanted to believe her, to take her hand and start rebuilding. But another part of me, the part that still ached from the pain she'd caused, wasn't sure if that was even possible. "I need time," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "I need time to figure out if I can forgive you. If I can trust you again." Kelly nodded, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "Take all the time you need," she whispered. The silence between us was heavy, but for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something, what I didn't know. But at least it was something. 2 weeks passed in a blur of work, silence, and distance. Kelly and I barely spoke, our interactions limited to polite exchanges about groceries or bills. The house felt like a tomb, filled with unspoken words and lingering resentment. I threw myself into the final stages of the investigation. Marty Blake was a slippery man, but we had him cornered. His confession had unraveled the network of the car theft ring, and with every new piece of evidence, it became clearer that Dick had been telling the truth. Marty had orchestrated the operation, using people like Dick as pawns in his schemes. Finally, the day came when the charges against Dick were formally dropped. The case was closed. Justice, at least in the eyes of the law, had been served. I arrived at the station early that morning to finalize the paperwork. Marcus was already at his desk, sipping a cup of coffee. "Dick's a free man," he said, glancing up at me. I nodded, setting my bag down. "About time. He didn't deserve to be dragged into this." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You going to tell him that?" "What do you mean?" I asked. "You've had it out for this guy since day one," Marcus said bluntly. "If you think he's innocent now, maybe you owe him an apology." The thought made my stomach twist. I hated the idea of admitting I'd been wrong, especially to a man like Dick. But Marcus was right. If I was going to move forward, I needed to put this chapter behind me. That afternoon, I drove to Dick's auto shop. The garage looked the same as it had the night I first questioned him, quiet, unassuming, almost too ordinary for the chaos it had caused in my life. Dick was in the middle of repairing a car when I walked in. He looked up, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable. "Detective," he said, his tone neutral. "Didn't expect to see you again." I cleared my throat, shoving my hands into my pockets. I wanted to let you know the charges have been dropped. You're officially in the clear. Dick nodded, his jaw tightening. Thanks. There was an awkward silence between us, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy in the air. Finally, I spoke. I owe you an apology, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment. I should have been more objective. Dick studied me for a moment, then shrugged. You were doing your job, he said simply. I get it. I nodded, grateful for his lack of hostility. For what it's worth, I believe you now. You got caught up in something you didn't deserve. Dick exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Appreciate that, he said. And I'm sorry too. For everything. I didn't mean to make things harder for you and Kelly. His words stung more than I expected, but I forced myself to nod. Let's just call it even, I said, turning to leave. That night, Kelly and I sat across from each other at the dining table, a rare moment of shared space. She had cooked dinner, something simple, pasta and salad, but the gesture felt significant. Dick's free, I said, breaking the silence. She looked up, her eyes cautious. I know. He texted me earlier. I nodded, pushing my food around my plate. I saw him today. Told him I believe he's innocent. Kelly's eyes softened, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of the woman I had fallen in love with. That's good, she said. I'm glad you talked to him. Another silence settled between us, but this one felt less heavy. It was as if the air between us had shifted, clearing some of the tension. I'm trying, Kelly, I said finally. I'm trying to figure out where we go from here. Her lips trembled, and she reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine. I know it's going to take time, she said softly. But I'll wait. However long it takes. I didn't pull my hand away, but I didn't take hers either. Instead, I nodded, my throat tight with emotions I wasn't ready to name. That weekend, I found myself driving aimlessly, needing space to think. I ended up at a small park on the edge of town, a place Kelly and I had visited early in our marriage. The memories of those happier times felt distant, like watching someone else's life through a window. I sat on a bench, staring at the trees swaying in the breeze, and wondered if love could survive betrayal. Could we rebuild what had been broken? Or was it better to let it go and start over? The answer didn't come easily. But as I sat there, the quiet of the park enveloping me, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single decision, it was a process, a choice you had to make every day. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to take the first step. The following week felt like a long stretch of gray days, each one bleeding into the next. Kelly and I still shared the same house, the same space, but we were living in different worlds. I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us, or if I even wanted to try. Work became my refuge. The Marty Blake case had wrapped up, and I was handed a fresh file to investigate. It was routine, a missing person, a trail gone cold, but it gave me something to focus on. Something other than Kelly. One evening, Kelly came into the living room while I was working through the new case file. She lingered in the doorway for a moment before speaking. Jim, she said softly. Can we talk? I looked up from my papers, my stomach tightening. What about? About us, she said, stepping into the room and sitting down across from me. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her fingers twisting nervously. I know things can't go back to the way they were. But I need to know, is there still a chance for us? Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. I stared at her, taking in the lines of worry etched into her face, the faint shimmer of hope in her eyes. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. Then I exhaled, leaning back in my chair. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to try. To rebuild. But another part of me. I'm not sure if I can trust you again. Kelly nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I understand, she said, her voice trembling. But I need you to know, Jim, that I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I love you. I've never stopped loving you. Her words cut deep, stirring something in me I hadn't felt in weeks. But love alone wasn't enough. Not anymore. That weekend, I drove to a cabin I'd rented in the woods, far away from the noise of the city and the tangled mess of my life. I needed the quiet to think, to decide what I wanted, what we both deserved. The cabin was small and simple, surrounded by towering pine trees. I spent the first day hiking through the woods, letting the crisp air clear my mind. By the second day, I found myself sitting on the porch with a notebook, writing down everything I was feeling. The anger, the sadness, the faint glimmers of hope. It all poured out onto the page. I thought about the man I'd been when I married Kelly. Hopeful, certain, ready to take on the world with her by my side. And I thought about the man I'd become, cautious, guarded, hesitant to believe in second chances. By the time I left the cabin, I still didn't have all the answers. But I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay in limbo forever. A decision had to be made. When I got home, Kelly was waiting for me in the kitchen. She looked up as I walked in, her expression unreadable. "You're back," she said, her voice soft. "I needed some time to think," I said, setting my bag down. "And I think I've made a decision." Kelly swallowed hard, bracing herself. "Okay." I leaned against the counter, meeting her gaze. "I can't forget what happened, Kelly. And I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you. But I'm willing to try." Her eyes widened, hope flickering across her face. "You are?" I nodded. "But it's not going to be easy. We're going to have to rebuild this from the ground up. And it's going to take time. I'll do whatever it takes," she said quickly, her voice breaking. "I swear, Jim. I'll do everything I can to make this right." Her sincerity moved me, but I held up a hand. "This isn't just about what you do, Kelly. I need to heal too. I need to trust you again. And that's going to take more than words." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I understand. I'll be patient, I promise." In the weeks that followed, Kelly and I began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. We started with small steps, honest conversations, shared meals, moments of vulnerability that felt raw but necessary. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the wounds felt too fresh, the distance too great. But we kept trying. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Not for what we'd been, but for what we could become. Something new, something stronger. And though the path ahead was uncertain, I was willing to walk it. With her.